The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing, examining how corporate consolidation and profiteering have led to supply shortages and high prices across the country. I'd like to remind members that we've established an email address and distribution list to circulate exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of today's hearing. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also ask all members to please mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. As a country, we're all fed up with crisis after crisis caused by giant corporations lining their pockets while the rest of America struggles to make ends meet. The latest crisis is a crippling shortage of baby formula. Over 40% of the most popular baby formula products are out of stock. Parents of infants with allergies are desperate to find the specialty formulas that their children need to survive. When parents can find formulas in stores, the price is up almost 20% over what it was a year ago. This is completely unacceptable. And we know why it's happening. Just two companies control 80% of baby formula production in the United States. When something goes wrong with one of them, the entire country feels the consequences. We're seeing this today. The largest U.S. formula producer, Abbott, shut down one of its plants in February due to bacterial contamination. Because of the loss of one plant of one company, formula shelves are empty. We do not have the diversity of other smaller companies capable of picking up the slack. Our supply chain is not resilient or nimble enough. We understand how a grave problem this is. The baby formula shortage is a case study of the market concentration problems plaguing the U.S. economy. When we allow corporations to concentrate their control, we allow them to concentrate all production capacity, and that concentrates a risk. It's a system designed to maximize short-term profits at the expense of safety and resiliency, and we're now suffering because of it. But while hardworking Americans are feeling the pinch, big corporations are not. Gas prices provide the perfect example. They have hit record highs, over $4 a gallon in nearly every state. But here's what it is telling. Big oil's profits are also at record highs. Last year, major oil companies posted their highest profits in nearly a decade. And this year, Chevron's first quarter profits quadrupled over last year. ExxonMobil and BP at least doubled their first quarter profits, and Shell's profits hit a new record high. American families are hurting. Workers have been furloughed due to supply chain disruptions. Paychecks are stretched, and consumers are paying more and getting less. Meanwhile, corporate executives are doing better than ever. According to the Wall Street Journal, the total compensation for most executives rose by 12%, while the median pay for CEOs of the biggest U.S. companies reached $15 million last year, a record for the 6th consecutive year. Certainly, part of what has caused high consumer prices includes crises that are largely beyond our control, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and Putin's war in Ukraine. But these events also laid bare the deeper and more systemic diseases that have been plaguing our country for decades now. American economic leadership has been undermined by years of consolidation, underinvestment, and focus on short-term profits at the expense of everything else. As Professor Reich has written, and I quote, "There's a deeper structural reason for inflation, one that appears to be growing worse, the economic concentration of the American economy in the hands of a relatively few corporate giants with the power to raise prices," end quote. As my colleague and friend, Senator Amy Klobuchar, has said, and I quote, "America's market power problem cuts across our entire economy. We see it in everything from cat food to caskets," end quote. Because of corporate consolidation, wages have stagnated and consumer prices across the board are climbing higher and higher. All the while, corporations are reporting windfall profit margins in one sector after another. They're taking advantage of the current crises to raise prices even higher. As the Economic Policy Institute recently reported, since the onset of the pandemic, nearly 54% of the spike in the cost of goods and services is attributable to higher profit margins by corporations. Over the past several decades, the largest corporations have chronically underinvested in research and development and their workforce. In fact, instead of investing in more resilient supply chains, innovation, new facilities, or workers, the firms in the S&P 500 spent 91% of their income on share buybacks or dividends between 2009 and 2018. Meanwhile, they have shipped jobs and manufacturing overseas and become strategic partners with America's adversaries. While this system is working great for wealthy CEOs in Wall Street, it's a disaster for working Americans who are struggling with high prices, empty shelves, and few competitive alternatives in the marketplace. And it's unsustainable in the long term because it threatens our economic prosperity and our national security. Americans are angry. They're fed up with CEOs boasting that record profits are being fueled by the pain being inflicted on working families. Americans are overwhelmingly demanding that Congress end the corporate greed and runaway consolidation that are at the heart of this crisis. Today's hearing is an opportunity for us to explore the root causes of these concerns and hear about solutions. I thank our panel of esteemed witnesses for appearing before us, and I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from the state of Colorado, the ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee, Mr. Buck, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the second hearing in this subcommittee entitled Reviving Competition. How tragic it is that an economy that should be growing and recovering from government-mandated lockdowns is instead stagnating in uncertainty over record-setting inflation, labor shortages, and a crippled supply chain. Americans face disastrous economic headwinds, and the Biden administration has doubled down on its failed policies. At our last hearing on this subject, inflation was 7%, now it's 8.3%. A gallon of gas was $3.31, now it's $4.33. Beef went from $4.55 to $4.92. I suggest we stop holding hearings. Perhaps most concerning, however, is the shortage in baby formula. Young mothers in my district are driving hours to find formula and feed their babies. The most vulnerable population in America doesn't have a stable source of food, and Congress hasn't done a thing about it. But of course, we just passed a $40 billion Ukraine aid package that included funds for global food security. Working families in the United States cannot feed their children, yet we're sending billions of dollars to countries that aren't even impacted by the war in Eastern Europe. To make matters worse, there wasn't even a requirement that the food in these programs come from U.S. producers. CNN, no friend to Republican talking points, recently tasked a reporter with tracking down baby formula. They used the Biden administration's new highly touted tools. The result? Hours on hold and no clear direction for parents in need to purchase formula. We can have a philosophical debate over the concentration of power in different sectors of our economy. I welcome a discussion of Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods and its anti-competitive pricing and delivery practices that force small independent grocers out of business. But to suggest that changes to competition policy will put formula back on the shelves for consumers is disconnected from reality, especially when the Biden administration is busy shipping pallets of formula to the southern border for illegal immigrants. The Biden administration and congressional Democrats need to stop hiding behind scapegoats and finally address the root causes of skyrocketing inflation. Between profligate spending, unabashed union protectionism, and radical environmentalism, it's no wonder how we got here. Since January, the price and availability of goods has gone from an expensive headache to a potentially disastrous shortage of critical products. If this is not addressed, I fear the statistics I'll be reading at the next hearing on this subject will be far worse. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now I will introduce today's witnesses. And again, I thank our witnesses for joining us today. Our first witness, the Honorable Robert Reich, is the Carmel P. Frisson Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. During the Clinton administration, Professor Reich served as Secretary of Labor. Time magazine named him one of the 10 most effective cabinet secretaries of the 20th century. He has written and published 18 books, including bestseller Aftershock and the Common Good. Professor Reich is the founding editor of the American Prospect, founder of Inequality Media, co-creator of the documentary series Inequality for All, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Additionally, he currently serves as a senior fellow at the Blum Center. Professor Reich received his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth University, his master's degree from Oxford University, and his JD from Yale Law School. Today's second witness is Dr. Rakeen Mahbood, the Chief Economist and Managing Director of Policy and Research at the Groundwork Collaborative. At Groundwork, Dr. Mahbood has led their efforts to explain how economic trends impact people's lives, with a focus on serious structural disparities and to investigate how corporate profiteering exacerbates inflation. Before joining the Groundwork Collaborative, Dr. Mahmood helped develop economic policy as a special assistant in the Office of Economic Policy at the Treasury Department. Dr. Mahmood also serves as a board member for the National Employment Law Project. She's been widely published and cited in some of the nation's most prominent publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR. Dr. Mahmood received her bachelor's degree from Wesley College and her PhD in government from Harvard University. Our third witness is Barry C. Lin, the executive director at Open Markets Institute. Mr. Lin is a leading expert on the threat monopolies pose to our democracy, economy, security, and individual liberties. He's written 3 books and been published widely by national publications, including The Economist, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, and The Wall Street Journal. Prior to helming the Open Markets Institute, Mr. Lin was the executive editor of Global Business Magazine and a correspondent for both the Associated Press and Agence France Presse in South America. Mr. Lin received his bachelor's degree from Columbia University. Today's last witness is Patrice Amuka, the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum, has worked in policy and advocacy in DC for more than a decade. Additionally, Ms. Anwaku is a senior adjunct fellow with the Philanthropy Roundtable and a Tony Blankley fellow at the Steamboat Institute. She's a frequent guest on Fox News and a co-host of O'Connor and Company, a show on DC's leading talk radio show. She also hosts a column called The New Agenda for Black Women on Newsmax.com and is a contributor to the Washington Examiner. Ms. Anaku received her bachelor's degree from Tufts University and her master's degree from Boston College. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for their participation. I will begin by swearing in our witnesses and ask the witnesses to turn on their audio if you are appearing virtually and make certain that we can see you. And please raise your right hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and I thank you. And I would remind the witnesses that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time frame, there's a timing light on your screen. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. I'll begin by recognizing Professor Reich for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The Commerce Department recently reported that corporate profits are at a 70-year high. Now, this raises an obvious question. When corporations are so flush with cash, why are they raising prices? Now, it's not solely because of the increasing costs of supplies and components and labor. Corporations enjoying record profits in a competitive economy would absorb these costs, keeping their prices down to prevent competitors from grabbing away customers. The underlying problem is large American corporations have so much market power they can raise prices with impunity. Since the 1980s, 2/3 of all American industries have become more concentrated, making it easy for corporations to informally coordinate price increases with a handful of other companies in their same industry, without risking the possibility of losing customers who have no other choice. Airlines, for example, have merged from 12 carriers in 1980 to 4 today, which now control 80% of domestic seating capacity. 3 giant cable companies dominate broadband. A handful of drug companies control the pharmaceutical industry. 2 giant firms dominate consumer staples. 3 global alliances now control 80% of global container ship capacity. 4 giants control over 80% of meat processing. The biggest U.S. oil companies, headed by Chevron and ExxonMobil, posted near record profits last year, but they're raising prices at the pump nonetheless because they don't worry about losing market share to competitors. Meat prices are soaring because the 4 giant meat processing corporations that dominate the industry are using their market power to extract even bigger profit margins for themselves, according to the White House National Economic Council. Corporate executives brag about their pricing power on their earnings calls with Wall Street. The CEO of Tyson Foods credits his company's profits with its, quote, successful pricing strategies. The head of 3M boasts of a, quote, marvelous job in driving price. The CFO of Hormel says, quote, we've done a great job with our pricing, and so on and so forth. One reason baby formula is out of stock is lack of competition. The largest producer with more than 40% of the market is Abbott. After 4 babies were hospitalized and 2 died from bacterial infections, the FDA appropriately recalled Abbott's baby formula products, leaving families that depend on infant formula in the lurch. Now, it would be one thing if corporations were using their profits to invest in higher productivity, better product quality, and so on, but they're using them to buy back their own shares of stock to deliver higher returns to shareholders. Stock buybacks hit a record last year. This year is on track to exceed that record. The oil giants are planning to buy back even more than last year. Abbott, instead of investing in safety of its factory, bought back billions of dollars of shares. Big corporations are doing what their shareholders want them to do, maximize profits and share values. Unless or until there are laws preventing them from doing this, they will continue to do this. So I recommend that Congress and the administration, number 1, strengthen antitrust laws and enforcement. Number 2, prevent price gouging. The Federal Trade Commission has the power to carry out investigations and impose penalties under existing law. Number 3, tax windfall profits on the profits of large corporations that exceed their average profit level from 2015 to 2019. And also, finally, tax buybacks. This would make companies think twice before putting shareholders ahead of American families. Congress and the administration have the power to stop corporations enjoying the highest profits in 70 years from raising their prices, thereby requiring American workers and consumers to subsidize wealthy investors. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rush. I now recognize Dr. Mahbood for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Rakeen Mahbood, and I'm the Chief Economist and Managing Director of Policy and Research at the Groundwork Collaborative. Groundwork is an economic policy think tank dedicated to advancing a coherent economic worldview that produces broadly shared prosperity and abundance for all. My testimony today will focus on 3 key points. First, mega corporations are seeing the highest profit margins in 70 years. Second, entrenched concentration has facilitated high levels of pricing power by corporate actors for decades. But the pandemic, the cover of inflation, and geopolitics has given these companies new opportunities to exercise that pricing power, and investors are egging them on. Finally, the brunt of these price hikes does not fall evenly across our economy. Small businesses, low-income people, and people on fixed incomes are paying the highest price. Recent data and research lays bare the role of plain old profiteering in recent price hikes. Bureau of Economic Analysis corporate profit data released in April revealed that corporate profits of non-financial firms surged 35% in 2021, and overall profit margins reached their highest level since 1950. And recent analysis from the Economic Policy Institute finds that approximately 54% of the price increases that consumers are experiencing come from an increase in corporate profits. By contrast, labor costs, primarily wages, and non-labor costs, such as input costs, have only contributed 8% and 38% respectively. Groundwork has combed through hundreds and hundreds of earnings calls where executives tell investors about last quarter's performance and what they can expect going forward. Over and over, the message from corporate America is clear. They aren't just asking consumers to pay for their rising costs, they're going for more. Some of the most egregious cases are corporations like Visa and MasterCard, a duopoly that controls over 70% of the payment network market, which cannot even blame supply chain disruptions for their profiteering. Since credit card companies make their money on a fixed percentage fee off of each transaction, inflation means they will automatically see higher returns. But of course, these companies are not content to stop there. Both Visa and MasterCard also reported that they would be raising the fees themselves, netting even more in an environment already difficult for small businesses. In short, Visa and MasterCard are using the power afforded through their duopoly control of the market to raise fee on small businesses and consumers who have nowhere else to go. Wall Street's influence in every corner of our economy makes this period of inflation unique and puts us at risk for a profit price spiral. As price hikes drive up profits, investor demands for those profits also goes up. Take oil and gas companies, an industry dominated by 7, quote, super major companies. Despite the significant hardship that higher gas prices have incurred on families around the country, producers resolutely refuse to increase supply to respond to the increasing price of gas. As the CEO of Pioneer Oil replied when asked to explain, he said, quote, "It's all about the shareholders. Our shareholders own this company. They want a return of cash," end quote. In fact, 59% of oil and gas executives recently told the Dallas Fed that investor pressure is the primary reason publicly traded oil companies are throttling supply despite high prices. And investors have cashed in across the board. In 2021, S&P 500 firms spent nearly $900 billion on stock buybacks, and US company paid out nearly $1.5 trillion in dividends to shareholders, both record highs. Small businesses in particular face unique challenges as they fight to survive in deeply consolidated markets. Small businesses have a harder time navigating global supply chains as large corporations throw their weight around in order to jump to the front of the line with shipping companies. Meanwhile, small business owners sit and wait with empty shelves. Big businesses also strong-arm suppliers into deals that raise prices for small businesses and leave them waiting longer for goods and products. Giants like Walmart and Amazon have the buying power to negotiate more favorable contracts with suppliers in the first place, leaving small businesses struggling to keep up. Giant corporations' control over our supply chains and economy more broadly has supplanted the functioning resilient system we could have built through robust public investment and free and fair competition. But it's not too late. We have many policy tools at our disposal. Congress can strengthen antitrust laws already in the books, better enforce them when anti-competitive behavior reaches the threshold for price fixing and collusion, and enact the federal price gouging statute to curtail exploitative pricing during emergencies. Congress can also ensure corporations are paying their fair share of taxes and implement an excess profit tax on mega corporations when appropriate. And finally, Congress can make long overdue investments in our supply chain infrastructure to ensure that large corporations can't game the system and use their market power to rig the playing field further in their favor. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mahbood. I now recognize Mr. Lin for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak on this set of grave, even existential threats to the American people. I am Barry Lin. I direct the Open Markets Institute. It's good to see you all. Over the last year, the American people have learned that extreme concentration of industrial capacity and control has empowered corporations across the economy to engage in the greatest bout of price gouging in more than half a century. The resulting surge in prices has severely harmed every wage earner and small business owner, indeed almost every person and family in America. Yes, other factors, COVID, war, play a role in driving prices higher, but it's the choke pointing of capacity that embeds inflation deep into the structure of the economy. But this chokeflation, or stranguflation as we might call it, as harmful as it may be, is also merely a symptom of an even more dangerous set of threats to the security and well-being of America as a whole and every American individual. That's because the same concentration of capacity and control that corporations pursue to boost their pricing power also radically increases many forms of physical risk. This includes the risks of severe shortages of food, drugs, fuel, and housing, even, as we now know, baby formula. Severe shortages of the capacity to build weapons, think Stinger missiles. Political coercion of individual corporations or the US government itself by antagonistic foreign powers, China, Russia. Even cascading catastrophic collapses of entire industrial and financial systems. So my first main point is that inflation and shortages are two sides of the same coin. The corporate master breaks the factory, the machine, the skilled worker, the technology, so that he may take more for less. It's a swell way to do business, to profit from your own failure. But this breaking can go way too far. Indeed, the breaking of the last 40 years now threatens the security of every American in new and terrifying ways. My second point, the concentration of capacity behind all these threats is the direct result of anti-democratic competition policies designed precisely to concentrate wealth, power, control, and capacity in the hands of the few. The process began with Ronald Reagan's embrace of Robert Bork's efficiency theory of antitrust. It continued with Bill Clinton's embrace of Larry Summers' efficiency theory for trade. Many understood at the time that it was unwise to put all our eggs in one basket and then to put that basket inside the borders of China. It was 20 years ago this month that I first detailed these immense political dangers and economic dangers in this cover story for Harper's. It's called Unmade in America, The True Cost of a Global Assembly Line, 20 years ago. It was 17 years ago this summer that I published an entire book on the issue, End of the Line, 17 years ago. Others warned as well. In 2002, the first annual report of the U.S.-China Security Review Commission fully embraced the warning of supply chain fragility and danger of coercion. 2002, a U.S. government document. In 2005, the epidemiologist Michael Osterholm warned of how concentration threatened our supply of N95 masks. That was in 2005. But the warnings were ignored, dismissed, suppressed by executives, economists, antitrust officials, and the financiers who back them, time and again, year after year, because if the master cannot break, the master cannot take quite so much. So despite all the warnings, it was the master's right to break that was kept intact. Third, the good news. This crisis provides a clear and stark imperative to rebuild America's industrial systems in ways that boost both our security and our prosperity, including by fostering the sorts of competition that drive down prices, drive up wages, and jumpstart true innovation. Our task is technically simple. Enforce our anti-monopoly laws as intended. Update the laws where necessary. Most important, however, is to remember always that a main reason to stop corporations from trying to take America is to stop them from breaking America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lin. Ms. Onwuka, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and members of this committee. Thank you for having me up here today. My name is Patrice Onwuka, and I'm the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum. We're a nonprofit organization committed to increasing the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty. And my work focuses on the economy as well as expanding opportunities for women. Now, as we emerge from this pandemic, it's been encouraging to see the recovery of women's participation in the labor force. The tight labor market has rewarded them with rising wages and increased flexible work. But rapid inflation has placed these gains at risk. As we know, inflation rose 8.3% in April over the past 12 months, and prices are rising in every major category with significant increases in energy, food, and shelter. For another month in a row, women have watched inflation erode their purchasing power, and households have been forced to do more with less. The hardest hit, as we've heard, are the low-income households and those on fixed budgets, such as the elderly. Women know what this means. We drive 70 to 80% of consumer purchasing power, and so we're attentive to what what choices our families have to make because of it. Gasoline hit another record today at $4.52 a gallon. A year ago, it was $3.04, and 2 years ago, $1.96. So, and even worse, parents of newborns and babies face the dual hardship of rising prices on baby formula, as well as this unprecedented baby formula shortage. Americans are right to worry about inflation and to see it as the top issue facing them. But Congress and the Biden administration are wrong to scapegoat a few specific industries for this kitchen table problem. This is an attempt to deflect attention for how failed policies and massive federal spending are at the root of inflation. Arguments about today's spiking inflation due to price gouging are disingenuous. Furthermore, solutions could raise, not lower, prices for American households. Price gouging usually occurs in a narrow market over a short period of time. However, prices have been rising for over a year and have spiked on items in every sector. Are large and small companies colluding to raise their prices? Now, sure, we've heard a lot about corporate profits today rising. Profits do rise with inflation. They also did plummet during the beginning of the pandemic. Profit is not a bad thing. Economists are skeptical of the price gouging allegation against large companies. A survey of two out of three economists from America's top universities, including MIT, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, disagree with, quote, the question, Does dominant corporations in uncompetitive markets taking advantage of their market power raise prices in order to increase the profit margins lead to today's inflation? Again, 2 out of 3 said no. In fact, some industries with the largest price increases are highly competitive. We've heard a little bit about gasoline. Well, the top 5 companies providing gasoline in this country, not one of them owns more than 12.5% of the market share. The top 5, about 36% of the market share in total. So new legislation that cracks down on mergers and acquisitions or attempts to control prices will not lower them, but lead to higher prices and stifle the innovation that leads to more options for consumers. No doubt supply chain issues and disruptions, labor market shortages are at play and increase the cost of production. But demand has been extraordinary, and unfortunately, we haven't heard enough about demand here today. From March 2020 to March 2021, the U.S. government made massive direct payments to American households through stimulus, expanded unemployment insurance, mortgage, student loan forbearance. That kept demand humming along. But the American Rescue Plan in 2021 added significant cash payments, including the expanded child tax credit, at a time when millions of jobs had been recovered, at a time when vaccines were being distributed, and the economy was experiencing a tremendous rebound. The Federal Reserve also engaged in hyper-expansionary monetary policy. Quote, "There is a chance that microeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation." Former Obama administration Treasury Secretary Larry Summers in early 2021. He was right. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco estimates that the American Rescue Plan added 3 percentage points to inflation. So driving down inflation ought to be a key area to reduce inflation. That includes not passing new stimulus or increased fiscal spending on new entitlements and student loan forgiveness. But maybe Congress could spend some time figuring out how to ramp up supply by raising labor force participation, reducing import restrictions, reducing regulations, keeping corporate tax rates low and encouraging oil drilling and then going after price gouging. American households truly are hurting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The committee will stand in recess briefly. The votes have been called. There are only 2 votes, and we'll come back as soon as those votes are concluded. I beg the indulgence of our witnesses, and we'll return. We'll stand in recess.
I had one more really great story, and I saw the one.
Oh, do you have your- I don't think he does.
The committee will come to order, and I want to thank again the witnesses for the indulgence and the members of the subcommittee. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule, and I will recognize first the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to our witnesses for your indulgence and for being with us today. We all know that prices are rising and Americans are feeling it, especially at the gas pump where prices are spiking to their highest point ever. But instead of increasing production to meet demand, major oil companies are spending on buybacks and dividends, bragging of record profits. I'm sure we all heard the audio. ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, and BP each reported their largest profits in 8 years, with the 4 companies totaling profits approximately $71.5 billion in 2021. And again, of course, we're not here today to talk about profits necessarily. God bless them, but we are here to make sure that they are not taking advantage of a tough time and continuing to work in the best interest of the American people. These oil and gas companies are able to keep prices high and bank record profits because they have very little competition. The lack of meaningful competition means there are no competitive checks on bad behavior, such as profiteering by dominant corporations. We do need stronger enforcement and successful execution of existing antitrust laws and policies. I think we say that in just about every hearing. So my first question is for Dr. Mabud. Can you give us some examples of companies that have used inflation and, unfortunately, the pandemic as cover to raise prices and increase profits?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. What we hear in these earnings calls is that in sector after sector, CEOs are blaming inflation, supply chain snarls, basically everything but their own need to profiteer for higher prices. This is especially the case for companies like Kimberly-Clark, which produces what economists call price inelastic goods, essentially essentials that, parents who need diapers are going to pay whatever they need for diapers. And so Kimberly-Clark has the market power and the ability to jack up prices because they know they're not going to lose consumers if they do so.
Thank you so much. Professor, what are the consequences of the reduced successful enforcement of antitrust laws?
Well, Congresswoman, what we've seen over really the past decades is that the courts have reduced the scope and effectiveness of antitrust as a means of maintaining the competition and the competitive process. The result of that is that more and more corporations dominate their industries. They have the power to set prices. They have the power to basically generate profits that are not being poured back into production or going into higher wages. Their profits are going more and more into stock buybacks that reward their shareholders, but don't really help the overall economy. The bottom line consequence for all of this is not only higher prices than are necessary, but also lower quality goods, as we see with regard to Abbott Nutrition and the baby formula crisis really that's gripping America. That would not have been a crisis if that particular industry, like many other industries, was not so concentrated in the hands of a handful of producers, and Abbott is the largest producer. So you see how vulnerable this degree of concentration makes all of us.
Thank you so much, Professor. Mr. Lynn, the Department of Energy has reported that global clean energy markets are expected to reach $23 trillion by the end of this decade. However, the United States currently lacks the manufacturing capabilities necessary to actively participate in many of these markets. As I was walking in the door, you were saying when we put all of our eggs into one basket, the problems that can result from that. What are some of the causes of the loss of domestic manufacturing capacity? And how can we reverse these trends and bring back more manufacturing back to the USA?
I'll answer that with one word: silicon. North of 95% of all silica ingots come out of China. These are the ingots that are used to manufacture photovoltaic panels around the world. It didn't used to be that way. These ingots used to be made in the United States. It used to be made in many places around the United States. The Chinese concentrated that power in ways that would give them the ability to choke off and control the manufacture of panels at their desire. What do we do about it? We open new silicon refining and ingot manufacturing facilities in the United States. There's mines all over that could be opened. There's one in West Virginia on the Ohio River. We could do that tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our witnesses again. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would now normally recognize the ranking member, but he's asked that I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. Onwuka, the root causes of inflation, I think, were not driven by private sector. The inflation that we're feeling now is a result of government intervention and probably some reckless spending. Coronavirus didn't cause our supply chain issues. Shutting down the economy did. And I think now what we're seeing is some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are trying to convince the American people that the only solution would be more government, and it's not going to work. Just last week, Congresswoman Schakowsky introduced the so-called Price Gouging Prevention Act. This bill, supported by some of my colleagues again on the other aisle, would make the FTC the arbiter of what constitutes unreasonable price increases. If this were to become law, companies, there would be no incentive for them to raise wages because they would be taken to court and be loaded up with many legal bills. So when prices are fixed too low and companies stop producing, which is what we saw during the 70s with the Arab oil embargo, can you just give us your thoughts or elaborate a little bit on policies such as price fixing that in this bill or in President Biden's recent quote-unquote plan to fight inflation, how it's not going to work or how it's poorly thought out?
Thank you, sir. It's so interesting that we're talking about price controls because they don't work on many levels. On a theoretical level, the idea of, setting prices, which is likely to happen for the government to set prices below the market level, would obviously, increase the demand, and supply would not keep up with it. That is exactly what we have now in terms of shortages when we look at baby formula, but we don't have, that's not what we want across the entire economy. You referenced it just now. Historically, we have seen price controls not work. We look back to President Nixon trying to control oil and gas prices. It's not economic. It's the idea that we can use technocrats, for example, can somehow determine the best prices across the country, across millions of products in our entire economy, across our entire nation, is a recipe for failure. And so when I see things like price controls showing up in pieces of legislation, they may be well-intended, but we've already seen historically the consequence that happens. And so as I mentioned, when we talk about what's driving inflation, we have not heard enough about demand. And demand, certainly supply has been shortened for many different reasons, but demand was inflated because Congress decided to give American households quite a lot of stimulus in lots of different forms, regardless of whether or not the realities really warranted them, particularly back in 2001. So we are now living with the consequences of that.
Yeah, very good. Just one other kind of secondary effect, I guess is the way I would describe it. We've just saw a double-digit increase in the price of farmland in my home state of Wisconsin. And obviously it's tied directly to the price of production, crops, and the yields that are affected by the cost of land. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that bigger picture on not only just farmland in Wisconsin, but automobiles and other major purchases that consumers may be looking at in the future?
Absolutely. So at Independent Women's Forum, we actually put together a price tracker that looks at some of the cost increases every month on things that American households are looking at and purchasing. Obviously, used cars are increasing. Everything from shoes to, the milk, and I buy lots of milk because I have 2 toddlers right now. But when you think about things like what goes into the production of those goods that get onto our shelves, I mean, the cost of fertilizer that feeds, that leads to produce or feeds cattle, for example. There's so many increases on the production side. And the producer price index certainly has hit almost a new high last month. Those costs are being, some of them are being borne by large companies and small companies, and they pass that on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So when I worry when I hear about price gouging being the only reason why things like farmland or the cost of meat is rising, because there's so many other costs that I think a lot of companies are actually eating that don't get passed on, and some that get passed on. Labor costs are rising. And when we look at goods-producing companies as well as service-producing companies, we didn't see labor costs substantially rising in 2020. We did see them rising substantially in 2021 because of worker shortages. Well, why did we have worker shortages? Well, there's plenty of stimulus going into American households that discouraged work. So lots of these factors are going into what's driving inflation, demand, and supply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for you back. I would just note that the bill you're referring to, I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of. It's not a price control bill. It's an anti-gouging bill. And as you know, Mr. Fitzgerald, there's an anti-gouging bill in the state of Wisconsin, and I know you in the past supported. So I just want to be clear, it's not a price control bill. So I want the record to be clear on that. And I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, and thank you to our expert witnesses for joining us here today. This hearing to address how we need to update our antitrust laws to combat market consolidation, anti-competitive behavior, and corporate profiteering could not be more timely. In recent weeks, families in my district and across America have been struggling to find infant formula after a plant closure created a national infant formula shortage. There couldn't be a stronger example of how market consolidation in our economy can hurt everyday Americans. Critical supply chains for things like food and energy production have become increasingly fragile as past administrations failed to do adequate oversight. The consolidation has put the U.S. on a dangerous path towards more frequent and severe supply chain disruptions, and the infant formula is just one of the ones we've been examining. Meatpacking is another good example. But so when we have these disruptions, they halt vital supply chains and have really devastating consequences for Americans. Earlier today, my colleagues and I sent a letter urging the administration and its constituent agencies to take corrective measures to increase the supply of baby formula in the short term, but also to examine long-term solutions and restore competition and resilience in the market to prevent future disruptions. So I know that Congress and the administration can solve this problem together, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what our experts have to say by way of some suggestions. So Secretary Reich, I know you've tweeted some opinions on the subject already today, but I'd like to look at what kind of things should Congress do to update our antitrust laws to fix the problems created by decades of anti-enforcement philosophy?
Congresswoman, there are a number of specific steps that Congress can take. One area that has caused a great deal of confusion, and the courts have constricted antitrust authority, has to do with Section 2 of the Sherman Act. Now, I understand the confusion. I understand what the courts have been doing. I understand why they've been doing it. But the net effect is basically to enable more and more monopolization and to require a very high threshold with regard to what the courts need to find and what prosecutors need to show in order to prove monopolization. That's one area that I would zero in on. Another area that is, I think, extremely important has to do with the Federal Trade Commission's authority under Section 5 to go after various mergers. And it used to be that they could go after mergers even before those mergers occurred. I think Congress ought to restore and strengthen that authority as well.
Thank you. Well, so we find ourselves in a position where there have already been multiple mergers within the infant formula sector. Mr. Lin, do you see any way to get us out of the situation? One thing that's been suggested is possibly using the WIC program to try to be empowered through increased funding and resources to be part of the solution. Can you help us out there?
Yes, thank you. Government purchasing is actually a power that can be used to concentrate the market, or it can be used to deconcentrate and create more competition within the market. It's procurement is one of our most important tools. It has, for most of our history, it was used to promote competition. So absolutely, government procurement through the WIC program can be used to require, to establish more providers and to sort of ensure that there is resiliency in the system, such as by ensuring that there's extra capacity that is available in case of a crisis. We should never be running a system like this at 100% of capacity ever.
Yeah, I think that goes to something Dr. Mahbood may have discussed, which is the sort of knife-edge supply chains that can't really handle fluctuation. Can you comment on that, Doctor?
Absolutely. Over the last 50 years, mega corporations have shaped our supply chains into the brittle system that we have today, so that when we experience shocks, whether that's a plant shutting down that produces baby formula or a pandemic, we experience bottlenecks and shortages that drive up prices. And big corporations can use their dominance in markets to hike up those prices, especially when they have the cover of inflation. And I think we can build an economy that can handle additional demand without breaking. And I look forward to Congress making those critical investments.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is a question eventually for Ms. Onwuka, but here's the background for it. State Street, BlackRock, and Vanguard currently control about 20% of the S&P 500. Now, they're not using that control for the benefit of the investors. They're using it for carrying out a political agenda. Yet today, we have not heard a peep about that huge accumulation of capital. Not a peep. We've heard all about the companies that they own. Now, what I understand from reading, of course, they're doing is making it almost impossible for gas companies, natural gas companies, to get the financing to put in pipelines. And assuming they could get the financing, we find that there are huge barriers being constructed at the bureaucratic level to prevent those pipelines from ever being built. And yet, Europe is facing an existential crisis when it comes to energy, which can only be solved with natural gas making its way across the ocean. And yet we don't seem to have the ability because of this huge accumulation of capital by State Street, BlackRock, Vanguard, because they're bringing that leverage against banks that they happen to control not to lend the money. Can you comment?
I think you've hit on some of the hypocrisy that we're seeing here when it comes to what companies it's okay for them to aggregate wealth and power and how they leverage them for different reasons. I think you certainly laid out a compelling argument there. I don't really have anything else to add to it.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. You mentioned that we should be opening mines all over the United States. I happen to agree with you. And in fact, in my Natural Resource Committee, we've heard over and over and over again about why we shouldn't open mines. We've heard examples of water being interfered with cultural values being upset, with you name it, any number of reasons why we shouldn't mine copper, why we shouldn't mine lithium, why we shouldn't mine uranium, why we shouldn't mine nickel, why we shouldn't mine, in other words, anything. My question to you is, how do we tell the American people about the damage, the crazy position we have put ourselves in, not unlike Europe, relying upon Russia for all of that oil and gas. And here we are in the United States, the same exact position, yet we can't seem to touch any of these minerals right under our feet. Can you comment?
Thank you, Congressman. I mean, it's a fundamentally important issue. I mean, I certainly understand why there is concerns about certain types of mining practices, and I also, I feel the pain for people who have love for the land, but I also understand that, this is a fundamental issue of national security. When we depend 100% on foreign powers for anything, whether it's a component in our computers, whether it's a component in our drugs, or whether it is a mineral that goes into the supply chains, that puts us at risk. That gives the people who we cannot trust power over us. So we must find a way to actually open up more mines and open up more production, not just in the United States, but within the confines of the G7 nations with whom we are integrated.
Thank you, Ms. Onwuka. Back to you for my last question. It happens that 3 years ago, the price of natural gas per MMBTU was $3. A few minutes ago, I checked just while I was waiting to ask my questions. It's at $8.31. So it's gone from $3 to $8.31. And this is, of course, a natural gas. And we get a lot of talk about people going to the pump. We don't have as much talk about people trying to heat their homes. But here we have an increase of almost 300%. And so can you comment on the challenges that a family is going to face this winter when their natural gas heating prices, not to mention businesses across all the United States that use natural gas? Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. I actually wanted to read a quote from, we receive stories from regular Americans, from your constituents every day, looking at the rising costs that they are experiencing. And, home heating bills are one of those areas that we continue to track, one of those areas where we are seeing so many families struggling. And I do think it's one of those areas where it's going to continue to be an issue. I think this fall, we certainly heard many stories from families who could not afford to heat their homes, or they were making very tough choices when it came to how their family budget, which was obviously decreasing, their real wages were actually decreasing because of inflation. They were making some tough choices. And I think that's going to continue to be an issue until we figure out how to get back to a place where we recognize our energy sources our energy policy should respect all different types of energy sources, including natural gas.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Before I recognize it, next week, it looked like the ranking member wanted to say something about that. No? Okay. I now recognize the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for this important hearing. And I have to say, top of mind for me with a 6-month-old who eats like a horse is baby formula. And this issue is touching households across the country, and it needs a solution, and it needs a solution yesterday. Unfortunately, a lot of moms across America see finger pointing in Washington. They hear that this is Joe Biden's fault. I didn't know, maybe Joe Biden had a baby formula factory behind the White House that I didn't know about, that he's not operating. I don't think that's the case. They're hearing solutions that we should take the baby formula that's at the border for children who are detained with their parents and take their baby formula and let them starve and then put that baby formula in America. But they're not really hearing solutions that are realistic or that don't kill a baby at the border to have political theater in the United States. And so, Mr. Lin, my first question for you is it realistic that President Biden could invoke the Defense Production Act to increase production of baby formula?
It's realistic. I'm not sure it's actually necessary. I think that the fundamental point here is that this is not a zero-sum situation. We don't have to be like moving. We don't have to be moving formula from the border to Chicago to, it's like we need to be treating everybody the same. We need to be increasing production immediately. I think there was a major move yesterday to get the plant reopened. There's a major move to sort of bring production in from Ireland and elsewhere. So I think the Biden administration is taking ample actions immediately to improve the situation across the United States. What we need to be doing now is actually focusing in this room on how to ensure that this never happens again. How do we ensure that there is sufficient competition within this system, so that the corporations are not able to run their capacity at 100%? When a corporation is running their capacity as 100%, that is usually an indication of market power.
And Mr. Lin, is there any reason that EU regulated baby formula isn't good enough to import in the United States?
I don't believe so. I was just in Europe last week, and there's a lot of things we can learn from Europe. I doubt that there's something that is anything wrong with the EU baby formula.
And look, we want to have the highest standards for baby formula, right? This is our most precious citizens of our population. But it would seem to me that if it's good enough for European babies, it would be good enough for the FDA. And also, the last administration discouraged imports of baby formula from Canada in the reauthorized North American Trade Agreement. And again, I would offer that Canadian standards are probably just as good, if not tougher, than in the United States. I guess just one last thought on baby formula. When you say we want to make sure this doesn't happen again, going back to what you said as it relates to market power, what could you do to diversify the production of baby formula in the United States so it didn't happen again?
It's a sort of a two-tier problem. You got concentration in retail and you got concentration in production. So you actually have to attack it at both the level of retail and the level of production. The extreme concentration of power in the retailers actually has driven a lot of the concentration within production. So, but there's simple rules that can be imposed immediately that reduce the power of the retailers, and those are generally anti-discrimination laws that restrict their ability to engage in monopsonistic manipulation of suppliers. And then you sort of deal with the concentration within the suppliers.
Mr. Lin, your solutions, I think, are common sense. They're doable, and as a Democratic member of Congress, it doesn't reek of any partisanship, and I think that's what most moms in America want, right? Most moms and dads in America want right now. They just want solutions, and I thank the chairman for a solution-driven hearing on what we can do with this crisis. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lin, 3 weeks ago, you issued a press statement, OMI statement on Elon Musk and Twitter, Byline, Washington. In response to Elon Musk buying Twitter, Open Markets Institute Director Barry Lynn issues the following statement, and I quote from there the second sentence. The Open Markets Institute believes that the deal poses a direct threat to American democracy and free speech. Do you remember that statement you issued?
I do, Congressman.
I was just curious, 19 months ago when Twitter locked out the New York Post out of their account because of the Hunter Biden story, was that a threat to free speech?
I'd go back further, Congressman. Actually, in the summer of 2018, I made the case that when Facebook and Twitter were cutting off Alex Jones, I said that was a threat to democracy and free speech.
So when they banned the story in the October of 2020, would you call that a direct threat to democracy? I mean, I look at the days running up to the most important election we have, the presidential election, and they keep a story from the American people. So you would agree with me that was a threat to democracy?
I think that the threat to democracy is to have allowed so much of our media to be captured, the control over so much of our media to be captured by a few people in Silicon Valley.
That's not what I asked you. I asked you, was that, the fact that they blocked that story, was that a threat to free speech and democracy?
I think we see threats to free speech and democracy every day in this country, and they're opposed by the power.
You're not answering the question I asked you. I asked you specifically about that example. In the run-up to our most important election, we have a story about Hunter Biden's laptop that 51 former intelligence agents told us was Russian disinformation. We know that was false because the Washington Post told us 2 months ago that it was true. And I'm just saying, was that a direct threat to democracy and free speech, as you just said in your press release from 3 weeks ago?
I don't think my press release from 3 weeks ago had anything to do with what you're talking about, but I do believe that, as I said before, the concentration of power in the hands of Mark Zuckerberg and the junta at Google
Did you issue a press release
is
last
a fundamental danger to our democracy, and I have been thrilled by the ability of this committee.
I just want to ask you a question. Did you
to deal with this threat to our democracy?
Did you issue a press release in October of 2020 when that story came out and the New York Post was locked out of their account? Did you issue a press release then saying this was a direct threat to democracy and free speach?
No, I did not, sir.
How about 2 months ago when the Washington Post told us that story was actually true, that the Hunter Biden laptop was actually real, the eyewitness, Mr. Bobulinski, was real. The Washington Post did 2 stories within like 4 minutes. Did you issue a press release then saying that what happened before was
no,
a direct attack on democracy?
What we've been doing, Congressman, is focusing on the larger structural problems of our communications system, which also I know that this subcommittee has done a wonderful job of actually highlighting those problems and working to solve them. And I believe that that's the way to deal with this, is not to focus on individual problems, but to focus on the fundamental structures that pose direct threats to our democracy.
Have you talked to anyone at the FTC about Elon Musk's attempt to buy Twitter?
I have not, Congressman.
You've not talked to anyone?
I have not spoken to anyone at the FTC about Elon Musk trying to buy Twitter.
You just issued the press release.
You know, I just want to, if there's any doubt about this, I am a huge fan of Elon Musk. I think he's done wonderful things for the world. I think what he's done with Tesla is fantastic. I think what he's done with SpaceX is fantastic. And I just think you can't have too much power concentrated in the hands of one person. And that is pretty much the theme of everything that we do at the Open Markets Institute.
Do you agree, it's been announced a few weeks ago that the Biden administration in the Department of Homeland Security has formed a disinformation governance board. Do you agree with the formation of that board?
I think that there is a problem of disinformation in this country that is largely due to the structure of regulation over the platforms that control our communications in this country.
You think it's okay for government to decide what kind of information, which is exactly what this Disinformation Governance Board, you think that's okay?
I did not say that. I said it is important for the people of the United States.
Well, let me just ask it real simple. Do you support the formation of the board or not?
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
I don't know enough about that particular issue to say yes or no.
Come on, Mr. Lynn, you can give an answer to that question. Do you support it or not?
The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize the
You said he
gentleman.
could answer the question. I just tried to
He
get him to
answered
answer.
it already, Mr.
just tried to get a
Ranking
yes or no
Member.
answer,
I
Mr.
accommodated as much as I could. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all of our witnesses. I'm grateful for this opportunity to work with you all to improve our economy and lower costs for the American people. Secretary Raich, it's an honor to speak with you this afternoon, and I'm very grateful for your testimony. I want to ask you about some unsolicited testimony that we've received over the last week from one of the richest human beings who has ever lived, Jeff Bezos, Executive Chairman of Amazon. It all started when President Biden tweeted, "You want to bring down inflation? Let's make sure the wealthiest corporations pay their fair share." But Jeff Bezos, whose enormous corporation paid nothing in federal taxes during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, and which still pays a lower rate than the average American, thought that he knew better. He tweeted, quote, "Raising corporate taxes is fine to discuss. Taming inflation is critical to discuss. Mushing them together is just misdirection." Mr. Secretary, let me ask you directly. How would making the wealthiest corporations pay their fair share help bring down inflation? You've got to unmute yourself, sir.
Congressman, the answer is very direct and easily understood. If corporations pay their fair share, that means that other Americans don't have to pay as much. They can afford such things as childcare, which enables them to be more productive. It enables most of America, therefore, to generate more output, which brings down inflation. When you have the second richest man in America saying that the president ought to do this or this, and that particular man presides over a corporation that paid zero taxes in 2018, and over the last 4 years has paid, as far as I understand, a rate of about 13% on one of the largest sort of corporate incomes in the United States, if not the world, whereas most Americans are paying a much, much higher rate. You've just got to say to yourself, this is rich in all senses of that term.
Well, thank you. A few days later, we heard from Mr. Bezos. We heard more from Mr. Bezos, who has so much money, by the way, that he could give every Amazon employee a $100,000 bonus and still have as much in the bank as he had when the pandemic began. Can you believe that? Mr. Bezos continued, quote, "In fact, the administration tried hard to inject even more stimulus into an already overheated inflationary economy, and only Manchin saved them from themselves. Inflation is a regressive tax that most hurts the least affluent. Misdirection doesn't help the country." I had no idea that Jeff Bezos, who could single-handedly fund pre-K for every child in America, but would rather spend his money on vanity trips to space and cowboy hats, cared so much about the, quote, least affluent. Mr. Secretary, in your written testimony, you noted that investing in care would help reduce inflationary pressures. Would you explain for us how the provisions of Build Back Better would help the American people deal with inflation?
Absolutely. Congressman, first of all, if we had, and every American family had access to good, high-quality childcare, that would enable so many more people in the United States to work, to be productive, because they are productive, therefore the entire economy would be larger, therefore we would have less inflationary pressure. There are many other provisions in the Build Back Better bill that would also improve overall productivity. It's also the case with regard to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Infrastructure is another public investment. All of these public investments are investments in the future productivity of the United States, and as such, they improve the capacity of American workers to do better and simultaneously enlarge the capacity and output of the United States. All anti-inflationary steps.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Build Back Better and the bipartisan infrastructure law sound like great pieces of legislation to lower crisis for Americans and to lower inflation in this country. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Joe Biden was sworn in as president, the average retail price of gasoline was $2.38 a gallon. On Monday, according to AAA, it was $4.48. Many parts of the country have seen much higher prices, and this is not an accident. These are policy choices that led us here. Nor is it primarily due to Russia's war on Ukraine, as President Biden would like everybody to believe, because gas prices had already risen 48% since he took office. The rise in prices is the direct result of this administration's assault on the oil and gas industry. On his first day in office, he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. That was expected to bring more than 800,000 barrels of oil from Canada to the U.S. every single day. Not even a week later, President Biden signed his executive order to put a moratorium on oil and gas leasing on federal lands. And just last week, the administration canceled 3 lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. Why? Because they're pursuing a radical environmental agenda for the Green New Deal. It's destroying our economy. It's killing American consumers, and they seem not to care. Ms. Onwuka, it seems to me that the Biden administration spends a lot of time blaming oil companies for prices, but isn't that a little bit hypocritical since they want to make it harder to produce fossil fuels?
Well, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is a war on energy right now, particularly fossil fuels. Let me read you an interesting quote from someone. I meant to get to it earlier and I couldn't find it. But this person said, this gentleman actually, Paul Lemire, the price of home heating oil under Trump was about $2.25 per gallon. Under Biden now I have to pay $5.09 per gallon. To fill up my gas tank with Trump and his energy independence policies, I was paying $2 per gallon. Under Biden, I spend $4.45 per gallon. This is insane and has to stop. And I think this represents the perspective of many Americans who recognize when you are pursuing an agenda, whether it's clean energy or whatever you'd like to call it, there are going to be trade-offs that have to be made. And when you continue to make one particular or two particular industries your target, your enemy, making it difficult for companies to be able to produce more oil now and in the future, obviously it's going to have some negative impacts, and that shows up in the prices. You laid out some of those examples, the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, the freezing of new gas drilling leases on federal land. I mean, there's so many more, but it's so interesting when you look at the totality of all these policies, it bears out at the gas pump, frankly.
It does, and the great irony, the tragedy of all of it is that if you turn down domestic supply, if you make it impossible for us to meet the demand for fossil fuels here, oil and gas, it means that we've got to go hat in hand to OPEC and Russia and Saudi Arabia to get our demand met with the supply from overseas. And guess what? The supply overseas is produced in a much less clean, efficient manner. So ironically, they're doing more harm to the environment with these crazy policies. It makes no sense. Last week, the administration released the Biden-Harris inflation plan to deal with inflation, right? It includes increasing fuel economy regulations for cars and a pie-in-the-sky goal of ensuring, quote, 1 of every 2 cars sold in 2030 burns no fossil fuels. It's odd to me that our president and vice president really think that imposing more regulations on our auto industry is actually going to somehow lower the cost. What's your reaction to this plan? How ridiculous is this? Does it look, is it as ridiculous as it looks on its face?
I think it is. I mean, I think when I'm reading through the plan, I didn't see anything that's not any policies that are going to actually reduce costs today or in the future, frankly. And you know, whether you're talking about energy policies or some of the other things that are included, as well as some of the ideas, including Build Back Better, that we've heard today, are supposed to be anti-inflationary. Well, they're the definition of inflationary when we consider what the American Rescue Plan did in adding points to the inflation rate right now. So I don't see that the inflation policy that the White House has put out is going to make anything better. I think it's going to make things worse.
This so-called anti-inflation plan also mentions fuel economy regulations for trucks.
Yeah.
So imposing new requirements on the trucking industry seems to be a drag on our economy, given the important role that truckers play in the supply chain. So do you think we should be fighting rising prices by making it harder for trucks to deliver the goods that we use every day?
Absolutely not. And you know what? I spoke to a trucker in Missouri. He actually owns a trucking business, and he trains new truckers. And he said one of the challenges right now that they're facing in the trucking industry, they can't get manpower in part because of wages, but also because of the federal regulations when it comes to what truck drivers can do, how they have to work, how their compensation is tied to, stops and the amount of driving that they can do. So when we're in the middle of a pandemic with shortages, with difficulties getting goods from our ports to our store shelves, the last thing we need to do is increase regulations on the brave people who are out there every day getting our goods to our store shelves. And this is from a trucker in Missouri, someone who knows the industry quite well.
The pain is felt across the board. We need to reverse these policies. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I know that we had Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Raskin on the screen, but I'm going to go next to Ms. There's Mr. Raskin. He is back. I recognize the just very distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Professor Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you much. The biggest producer of baby formula domestically is Abbott Labs, which controls 40% of the market. And in February, they recalled formula produced at their Michigan plant in Sturgis because of bacterial contamination. And that plant has been shut down ever since. But at the end of March, instead of investing in making its manufacturing plant safer, Abbott Labs bought back $2.3 billion in an effort to boost share prices. So, Mr. Lin, what are the circumstances that would incentivize Abbott to spend money on enriching investors instead of innovating or increasing production at a time of crisis?
Thank you, Congressman. The incentives that would lead a corporation to favor payouts to its investors rather than the building out of new capacity at a time of crisis, it's simple. They control the marketplace. They have no fear. There's no one is challenging them. So if you have no fear,
you're attributing this to a lack of competition and to concentration in the market. Is that right?
absolutely. And actually, I think these numbers, what you'll see often when we look at numbers that show a certain corporation has 40%, another one has 35%, often those numbers are much higher within certain regions. You know, in agricultural markets, you often see 100% consolidation in particular regions where a single corporation buys all the production of chicken or milk or whatever. So these, consolidation is the heart of all of this.
Professor, thank you. Professor Reich, do you agree that that's a structural problem, that a company like Abbott would not be investing in its plant to expand production and capacity, but would be doing a buyback? Is that a problem related to concentration in the field? And if so, what can Congress do to eliminate these kind of perverse incentives for companies to buy back stock rather than invest in industry?
Congressman, there are two problems and they're related. One has to do with concentration. And as we've been talking about, in the baby formula industry, you have very, very few companies, and Abbott is the largest, so that it makes the entire system and American consumers very vulnerable when you have only one major producer, and that one major producer is shut down for a good reason, because it was not investing in quality control, which gets to the second point having to do with buybacks. Before 1984, the Securities and Exchange Commission did not allow buybacks. This was considered to be market manipulation. President Reagan's Securities and Exchange Commission decided that it was not market manipulation, allowed corporate buybacks. And what we see now is a record amount of buybacks. Adjusted for inflation, last year was a record. It looks like this year, according to Citibank, is going to be even a larger amount of buybacks. Well, instead of making investments in their plant, making sure that their plant was safe, what we saw with regard to this Abbott nutrition is that they simply wanted to make their investors richer by buying back shares of stock. We're seeing this all across the country. And these two problems are indeed structural problems. What Congress can do is not only enforce and strengthen the antitrust laws, but also can make buybacks either illegal or tax buybacks.
Well, let me pursue that for a second, because I feel like my eyes are opening here. So there's testimony that between 2009 and 2018, in that decade, firms in the S&P 500 distributed 91% of their net income back to shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividends. And so there was paltry sums going into research and development, new facilities, training new workers, and so on. So this, in fact, is, I think you're suggesting, a central problem, not some kind of peripheral issue. Is that right?
Yes, this is a central problem, and it is a growing problem.
Well, I appreciate your testimony very much. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this really urgently important hearing that goes right to the question of what we're dealing with in the baby formula crisis. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from California, the distinguished Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wonka, I'm confused. A little while ago, I understood some of my Democrat colleagues, your other panelists, to say that if you put money back in the consumer's hands, they will spend it in a way that will reduce inflation. Did you hear that?
I think I did, yes, sir.
So this is interesting. A stock buyback and dividend payouts, that puts money in the consumer's hands, sometimes directly, sometimes through pensions and so on. A tax cut puts money back into the individual's hands. All of these things that put money in individual hands do seem to be well worthwhile, and we certainly encourage it. But let's go through this. Isn't one of the two problems right now we have at inflation? One is excess demand by lots of money being printed out of the government, too much money, if you will, being out there, and supply chain interruptions. Those are the two biggest reasons, right?
Yes.
The third being the tremendous price increase of petrochemicals because of supply being limited by the policies of this administration.
Yes.
So I'm trying to understand, we're having a hearing on antitrust, and I've heard no testimony so far about these companies making dramatically excess profits. Amazon has been bashed constantly when in fact most of its divisions don't make any profits. And the one that makes a lot of profits, which is the one that right now is running the servers probably for this hearing, its biggest customer is the government. So am I missing something, or are we having an antitrust hearing so we can bash corporate profits even if they're distributed to the consumer?
From what I've heard quite a lot about profits today. I have not heard a lot about demand, excessive demand, and the source of that being the federal government and generous stimulus, probably unnecessary stimulus at different times over the past couple of years.
Well, I'd like to go back to supply chain. Supply chain disruption, some of it is outside of our control. What's going on in China, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, somewhat is out of our control. But if you'd comment on the rising fuel prices of all sorts in the United States, how much of that is within our control and could be changed? And oh, by the way, those are very large companies. They have large market share. We'll just have a given of why we're asking.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, as I mentioned earlier, the top 5 largest companies, oil-producing companies in this country only control about 36% of the market share. So there's still a lot of competition in the oil industry. That's number one. Number two, yes, rising prices, oil prices, certainly go into everything from transportation costs, rising costs there, to just heating your home, as we talked about before. So those are all going to be, underpinning a lot of the inflation. But when we talk about why are there supply chain disruptions, we also have to talk about the labor costs and the fact that people have been sitting on the sidelines of the economy. And why have they done that? Again, that goes back to demand. When you pay people to stay at home, when you, forgive or put on hold their student loan payments, you are putting a lot of money in the hands of regular people, and that's fine. But that is going to drive demand, and I haven't heard a lot of solutions on how we address that.
Let me just, no hearing in Congress these days is complete if you don't talk about climate change. So let me bring the subject up. Currently, Germany and other countries, because of the situation in Europe, are turning back on coal-fired plants. Huge amounts of additional coal are being burned as a result of current disruptions. The United States is unable to answer with additional clean natural gas or other fuels because of policies. How much of what would drive down the global price of oil and natural gas and eliminate the need for relatively high carbon coal would occur if the policies of this administration were at least favorable to the finance of those types of enterprises?
Well, I think we can look back at President Trump's administration when we were a net exporter, right, of natural gas. And so to put us back in a position where we're not vulnerable to the whims of other countries, even dictators, but in a position where we can actually help the world not be vulnerable to those same geopolitical issues, I think that's where we need to get back to. And policies that take us away from that we've seen over the past year, unfortunately put us in that vulnerable position.
And Mr. Lynn, I won't be time to ask you the question you didn't answer for the ranking member.
The time of the gentleman is but
I would hope in the future that we would answer a question, yes or no, when it can be answered, yes or no, and then go on to the rest of it. I was deeply disappointed. I know you as better than that.
And I will say, Mr. Lynn, I was gratified to see that you're a man of integrity and you answer the question truthfully. And despite the fact that the member of Congress didn't like the answer, you pressed, and I admire you for that. So with that, I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The pandemic has hemorrhaged the global supply chain. Corporate monopolies have worsened conditions. And this past year, corporate monopolies in various industries made record profits, and we're going to keep talking about these profits because they are crucial to this discussion. At the same time, essential products like meat, toilet paper, and baby formula flew off the shelves and rose to outrageous prices. My home state of Washington currently has the 4th highest gas prices, with prices in King County, where I live, currently at $5.07 per gallon. Oil and gas companies, as you've heard my colleagues on the other side talk about, want to try and attribute these prices to pandemic delays and wartime sanctions, or to the Biden administration itself instead of to profiteering. But let's look at the facts. First, Shell made $9.1 billion in profit from January to March, almost 3 times what it made in the same period last year, while Exxon raked in $8.8 billion, a near 3-fold increase over 2021. Second, even before the pandemic, U.S. producers lowered production and raised prices to increase profits for investors. Even though demand has increased, production of oil remains slowed. And one CEO even stated that even if the price goes to $200 a barrel, they are not going to step up production. Dr. Mahbood, why is oil production still experiencing these delays? What's going on?
Yeah, thank you for this really important question. Oil and gas companies, as you note, are making record profits, all while families around the country are struggling to take their kids to school and pay for their drive to work. As gasoline prices increased almost 50% in 2021, the 3 biggest US oil companies benefited from those higher profits and prices, and they saw their previously negative profits jump nearly $87.5 billion while boosting shareholder handouts by $4.5 billion in 2021. And that trend has only continued in 2022. And let's be clear, this is not about rising input costs. Even as the price of crude has started to come down in recent weeks, The gas prices have stayed sky high and consumers are really paying the price. You know, large oil companies are simply choosing to keep oil prices high despite lower crude prices to pad their bottom line and to pay out to their shareholders.
Thank you. Dr. Reich, big oil has achieved its highest profits in a decade, as many people have pointed out. 28 major fossil fuel businesses made a combined $93.3 billion in the first 3 months of 2022, a 127% increase from the same period in 2021. What have corporations done with these profits, and why don't we see them reflected in the average American's price at the pump?
Well, the simple answer, Congresswoman, is that they have bought back their shares of stock in an effort to raise their stock prices. This is not a new phenomenon, but it is new in the sense of how much they are doing right now. They're not pouring these profits back into production. They're not pouring the profits back into higher wages. They're not pouring the profits back into research and development. They are pouring the profits into raising share prices. And in terms of the United States economy overall, that is not a plus. In fact, the question that I think all of you, this hearing is really focusing on is quite simple and direct. When corporations are so flush, that is, they are enjoying the largest profits in 70 years, why are they raising prices? They should not be raising prices, particularly when they're just using those profits to turn around and buy back shares of stock. American consumers are paying the price.
Exactly the right question. Mr. Lin, gasoline is not a regulated commodity, which means that producers and retailers are free to charge whatever price they choose. Big oil blames pandemic delays, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but prices were rising long before Russia's invasion. How has the freedom of big oil to set their own prices impacted the middle class and lower income earners?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's, I mean, you cut to the heart of the issue here. I mean, what we see is a remarkably weirdly structured system with oil. You see a series of bottlenecks, starting with OPEC, and you see with the majors who actually have control over most of the big wells around the world. Then you see a power concentrated at the level of refining. There's not been a new a refinery opened in the United States since 1978. It's the same footprint it was in 1978. And then you have the commodities markets in which, on top of this deeply industrialized system in which the amount of oil can be guaranteed pretty much week after week, month after month, year after year, it's industrialized. And yet we have the prices jumping up and down. And that is, so the market itself, the market structure is actually one of the places we want to be looking at because the market doesn't make sense.
Well, thank you. Dr. Mahbood.
The time of the gentlelady has long expired.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't see the time clock. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Utah is one of the most vibrant and fastest growing economies in the nation, thanks to a strong, well-educated, trained workforce, booming tech industry, and innovative collaboration between business and government. So it's especially crushing to see inflated costs of living in Utah at 10.2%, which is 2% above the national average. Unfortunately, we return to the 1960 days of Carter, a time when our government forgot the basic 101 of economics and the impact of hyper-spending and federal price controls on a recovering economy. As it was with my generation during the 1970s, today's generations of young Americans will see in real time the impact of Democrats' failed economic policies. Everything costs more: rent, food, gas, clothes, vacations, there's loss of income. They will never forget this moment, and their bank accounts won't either. As it was with President Carter, history will not treat kindly the Biden administration and the Democratic-controlled Congress policies of 2021 and 2022. They are robbing hardworking American men and women of their wages and hurting their families. The constituents I hear from on a daily basis consider increased cost of living a very serious problem. The buck stops at the President Biden and his administration, who has had missteps from day one. He destroyed America's energy independence by closing the Keystone Pipeline, pulling our own petroleum reserves, pulling from our own petroleum reserves, and then selling the oil to China. Until last week, stopping the oil leasing in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, and then blaming the oil industry and the local service stations for price gouging. It's worth taking note that this week, gas prices hit another record high. Can't make this stuff up. At the end of the day, President Biden and his policies did this. I love the title of this hearing, Rebuilding America's Economic Leadership. If we are to rebuild America's leadership, it's up to our president and the Democratic Party to own up to their own disastrous decisions and change their ways. Mr. President, it's time to show true leadership and stop the blame game. Pointing the fingers at everybody else for every chaos, self-created chaos, is not working. Ms. Alwanka, it seems like, first of all, in Utah, we had prices of gas down to $2 a little bit more. In California, it's always been high, $4 to $5 more. Is it because they're price gouging in California and they're not doing it in Utah? I'm trying to figure out what the difference in there. Is it policies or just because these bad oil companies are doing in the California people?
I think at the state level, policies around taxes on gas, on gasoline come into play. Regulations when it comes to the gas and oil industries also come into play. So I suspect that that's what's going on in the different locations.
Do you have anything else you want to add to the fact that it appears that those who are taking risks, providing services, and doing it at a much cheaper price just about 2 or 3 years ago, why they're now the enemy of the other side of the aisle here? Any comments, any thoughts?
You know, I think that it's sad that we are at the point where our federal policy seems to do a disservice to those people who are risk takers, who are willing to invest to start companies, and we're talking about antitrust. So when small companies that provide great value build itself up to a point where it can be bought, acquired by another larger company, and then create added new value to the consumers through higher prices and new kind of products. So, you know, I do think it's a disservice that we're doing to these companies.
And I look forward to the day that we educate our young people again the way the free market works.
Yes.
The more competition, the lower the price, the better the product. That's the way it's been the American way. And envy has never worked for building a nation. And I just want to let the other side know, the aisle, that, you know, Robin Hood is a good movie, but it doesn't work. It never has been. It never has. You look to the Robin Hood attitude of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. It's what's happened to Cuba. It's what happened to Venezuela. It's what happened to Russia. Any place there's tyranny, you have this idea, you take away from the risk takers, the builders. By the way, by people who never built a thing. Those who never built a business never understand the risk that it takes and how it is to reinvest. And those who reinvest and look for a vision in the future, they will do it in a very smart way. Unfortunately, those who've never done it will never get it. So I look forward to being in a position as we get into this new Congress that we're going to start teaching our young people the free market once again, be proud of who we are, and to applaud the risk takers and the builders in our country. That make our country great. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the distinguished chairman of the Democratic Caucus, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, for your continued leadership with respect to making sure that we can right-size our economy, free market economy, well-regulated, but one that works for everyday Americans, not against them. And appreciate your continued leadership in the context of these hearings. I think what we hope to accomplish generally, certainly my perspective, is not to take from the rich to give to the poor, but to stop the rich from taking the productivity gains from everyday Americans, particularly over the last 4 decades, and basically hoarding it for themselves in a manner that has undermined the great American middle class and those who aspire to be part of it. Secretary Reich, thank you for your service over the years. And would it be fair to say that effectively, while the productivity of the American people has increased dramatically over the last 4 decades, I think in excess of 275%, basically less than 10% of those productivity gains have actually been received by everyday Americans, by working class folks, and by the middle class of those who aspire to be part of it. And the overwhelming majority of those productivity gains have gone to the privileged few.
Yes, in the short answer, Congressman, I think that what we are talking about here in terms of markets that are rigged, that are essentially non-competitive, in which a handful of companies can easily coordinate and do coordinate to raise prices and are doing it even more under the cover of inflation, is another way, another symptom of the underlying problem that you're pointing out. We have not seen this degree of inequality in terms of concentrated income and wealth at the top of America in over 100 years. And the result is that although the country is much more productive than it used to be 5 or 10 or 40 years ago, the typical American is not doing that much better, adjusted for inflation. And to make this a partisan issue, to blame one party or another, does a disservice to the United States. I mean, we've got to get and adapt the structure of our economy and the laws and regulations governing the economy, particularly antitrust, to a new era in which we have a record degree of corporate profits, corporate concentration, and corporate buybacks.
Well, thank you for that clarification, because I think foundationally, we shouldn't have this particular discussion at this moment in isolation as it relates to the profit taking that is occurring and clear evidence that certain corporations are taking advantage of an inflationary moment that may exist for a variety of reasons and or be connected to supply chain dynamics emanating from the pandemic to continue to pad their profits to the detriment of the American consumer. This is not an isolated situation. We've actually seen a march in this regard for 40 years. And no one is suggesting that the American people should somehow have a windfall. The American people's productivity has earned them a raise. They just haven't gotten it. And instead, what they've actually gotten in this moment are higher prices by individuals seeking to take advantage of the moment. Dr. Mahboud, corporations are seeing record profits, including, oil companies and some of the meat processors and others, but these savings, these profits, aren't being passed along in any way toward the consumer. Can that be explained?
Absolutely. And, Groundwork has been listening to hundreds of earnings calls, and I believe that we should listen to what the CEOs are telling us, right? Which is that they are really eager to jack up prices on consumers, all while bringing in record profits and issuing stock buybacks for their shareholders. EPI has done some great analysis here that shows that 54% of the price hikes that consumers are seeing are due to corporate profits, whereas only 38% and 8% respectively are due to input costs rising and wages. So this is the delta here, the difference between prices and profits is going straight into the pockets of CEOs and shareholders.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the beef processing industry, 4 dominant companies control 85% of the market. Wall Street has consolidated into 5 banks, and airlines have merged into just 4 major airlines. And we have 3 major cable companies controlling broadband and 3 dominant baby formula companies controlling 95% of the market. This widespread consolidation throughout the marketplace has allowed these dominant firms to set the rules of the game, and this has created an interconnected and very inefficient supply chain that has endangered the lives and strained America's wallets during this pandemic, all in the name of profit. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I look forward to an answer to this question from Ms. Onwuka Ms. Onwuka, you would not disagree with me that there is a correlation between rising gas prices and rising oil company profits, correct?
Thank you, Congressman. When inflation happens.
Is that correct? Is that correct?
Sorry, I was
That
just going
there's a
to.
correlation between rising gas prices and rising oil company profits?
Profits and inflation go hand in hand.
Well, profits and rising costs go hand in hand too, do they not?
Profits and inflation can go hand in hand, and when
Let me ask you this question,
prices
Ms.
fall, sir, also you see profits fall.
Let me ask
Thank
you, since you don't want to answer that question, let me see if you'll answer this question. To what degree has oil company price gouging contributed to the spike in gas prices?
I don't think that there's evidence that you can point to or anyone can point to say that it's price gouging that's leading to it.
Let me ask Mr. Reich the same question. What do you think, sir?
I'm sorry, Congressman, could you repeat that question?
To what degree has oil company, oil company price gouging contributed to the spike in gas prices?
Well, it's contributed substantially in the sense that if we define gouging, price gouging, as using your market power, your power to raise prices when you don't have to raise prices, when you are basically having enough profits that you could easily absorb the increasing cost of inputs, which in the oil company, we're talking about crude oil prices going up. That is price gouging, taking advantage of an inflationary environment to hide the fact that you are raising your prices and costing consumers more when otherwise you would not, you certainly in a competitive system, you would not be doing that. That would be my definition of gouging. Absolutely.
Thank you. The Economic Policy Institute recently observed that since the onset of the pandemic, nearly 54% of the spike in the cost of goods and services can be attributed to increased corporate profit margins. Mr. Reich, if our markets were truly competitive, it stands to reason that companies would keep their prices down to prevent competitors from stealing customers, correct?
Absolutely, and that is a kind of a principle that I think is easily understood. If you're in a competitive market, you're going to do everything you possibly can do to keep your prices down. Otherwise, competitors are going to grab market share away from you. And that's what we see in the competitive parts of our economy. Too much of our economy right now, though, is uncompetitive, dominated by big companies that don't have to worry about raising prices and losing market share.
Thank you. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said that these price hikes are due to inflation, but Mr. Wright, you've written extensively on this and you disagree. Why do the increases that we see have less to do with inflation and more to do with corporate power to raise prices?
Well, they have to do with corporate power to raise prices in the sense that corporations now, and we know this, have a higher degree of profitability than they've had in 70 years. Now, where's our profits coming from? The profits are coming partly from an increase in pent-up demand after the pandemic, but also from the fact that they don't have adequate competition. If they had adequate competition, they'd keep their prices down. They have the power to raise their prices. And they've been saying on earnings calls again and again, they've been crowing about, they've been boasting about their ability to maintain and increase their profit margins using the cover of inflation. And I think that's the critical point here. They don't want to be seen as raising their prices to increase their profitability, but they're using inflation as an excuse for raising prices and increasing their profitability.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Buck from Colorado, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lynn, first of all, thank you for talking about mining, a difficult subject for folks on one side of the aisle to talk about, and a little bit easier on my side of the aisle. And really, a head scratcher sometimes when we think about rare earth metals and the fact that many of those are no longer mined here in the U.S. Most of those have been transferred, and I think you mentioned this with silicon, have been transferred to China. Most of the production has been taken up in China. Any guess whether we do a better job of mining in a clean way here in this country, or whether China does a better job of mining in a earth-friendly way?
This is pure speculation, but I actually would assume that mining in the United States will be more highly regulated and will be result in a sort of more cleaner outcome.
I would make the same assumption. I'm not a miner, and so I'm not sure, but that would be my assumption. The baby formula plant, the Abbott plant, was closed on February 17th. You've mentioned that Abbott has a 40% market share, and that I think that we can all agree that that plant produced a substantial amount for Abbott Labs. And I don't think anybody's disagreeing with closing the plant given what happened, but was it foreseeable that if you close a major producer like that, that we would have a shortage at some point in the future, whether it's a month or 3 months?
Yes, it was absolutely foreseeable. We've seen this many times in the past. I mean, actually in my book, Cornered, I spent a long time looking at what happened with the shutdown of a single cat food facility, and this is about 2007, and it basically stripped out all the cat food across the entire nation. Shut down of a single facility, but almost every single brand was purchasing out of that one facility.
Ms. Onwuka, I want to ask you a question. You mentioned, I'm hoping, I wrote this down, and I hope I got it right. You don't hear a lot about solutions for demand. I think that's what you said. I've got one, and I'm just wondering if you'd comment on it.
Yes, Ranking Member. I mean, I think if...
Well, let me ask you the solution that I have, and then ask you to comment on it. My solution is that the federal government stops spending so much darn money.
I think that's a great solution.
There you go. We agree. Why?
Because we have a track record, and we can look back over the past year in particular to see that when the economic conditions of the country are improving, that is not the time for excessive stimulus, whether that's in expanding entitlements, whether that's in expanding direct payments to American families, because it becomes a disincentive to work, particularly if it's unattached to work requirements. And so that's what we saw driving the labor shortages, but we also saw demand not just return to pre-pandemic levels, but exceed that. And so demand is chasing after too few goods being supplied by the country.
I want to get to another line here. My daughter, son-in-law, and daughter-in-law are all in the oil and gas industry, and if I don't come to their defense, Thanksgiving dinner will be a very quiet dinner. An oil and gas company, from the time they apply for a permit to the time they put a drill bit in the ground is about 1 year. Once that drill bit is in the ground and they start producing, they have a life, it varies, but the lifetime of a well, the production actually starts decreasing dramatically after the 1 year point. So to say that oil and gas companies have some control over the profit when the oil is flowing, a certain amount of oil is flowing, and the price is more determined on a world market, especially by OPEC and other countries, I think is unfair. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to comment on that, understanding my Thanksgiving dinner dilemma.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I don't want you to get into any trouble with your children, but I think it's very interesting when we talk about signals. And federal policy can send signals to industries about the intentions when it comes to, in this instance, energy, and what the approach should be to treating different types of companies within industries differently than others. And I think the signal has been sent when it comes to oil and gas and natural gas that, this is not going to be a friendly environment for them to continue to produce. And so when you talk about canceling leases to be able to drill, when you talk about canceling pipelines, when you increase the regulations to make it so onerous to go into production, then obviously that's going to have a negative impact both in the short term but also in the long term. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we should be in a position of energy strength, not of energy vulnerability, particularly to other countries.
I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you. Secretary Rush, critics of the Biden administration have tried to use inflation and supply chain disruptions and even Russia's attack on Ukraine to score some political advantage. And sadly, I think you saw some of that during this hearing. So I'm going to ask you very directly, because of your extraordinary experience and scholarly work, are government spending, taxes, regulation, and workers causing the inflation and supply chain fragility that we're facing? And if not, what factors are contributing to the current crisis?
Mr. Chairman, the largest factors have to do with the pandemic, the end of the pandemic, and the sudden increase in pent-up demand for goods. And secondly, with the end of the pandemic, all sorts of supply chain issues, both domestically and internationally, because it's very difficult to crank up an economy relatively suddenly. It doesn't feel like relatively suddenly, but when you look at the complexity of those supply chains, it is relatively sudden. Now, where does that leave the issue of concentration? Undoubtedly, concentration in terms of corporations that are not competitive is adding to the problem. It is not, in my judgment, the core problem or the first or only problem, but it is a large and growing problem. And it is a large and growing problem for the economy overall. As we see with the baby formula problem, it's not just with regard to increasing prices, it's also with regard to vulnerability to plants that have to be shut down or supplies that have to be in some way constrained. If we are dependent on fewer and fewer big corporations, we are more and more vulnerable. And so I think realistically, and putting the politics aside, this committee and also the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee really does have a lot of work to do to bring antitrust laws up to date and make sure that we have bold and strong antitrust enforcement and laws that enable our antitrust enforcers to break up the big monopolies that now dominate the American economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Dr. Mahbood, I want to respond very directly to the claim that was made by Ms. Owanekunu, about there being a lot of competition in the oil industry. Over half of the world's oil supply and 90% of the world's oil reserves are controlled by a cartel of nationalized oil companies known as OPEC Plus, actually, which is led by Russia and Saudi Arabia. And in the private sector, super major oil companies are vertically integrated at every level of the supply chain, thus exerting influence far beyond what their market share in any single market might suggest. The oil and gas industry is hardly, in my view, a model of competition, as demonstrated by the fact that big oil is seeing its highest profits in decades. So I'd just like you to respond directly to that claim that there's lots of competition in the oil industry, and what is the principal cause of the increase at the gas pump?
What you point out is exactly correct. This is a deeply, deeply concentrated industry, and each of these companies have enormous amounts of market power that they are using in this moment, right? I mean, I mentioned before, crude prices are starting to come down. Prices at the pump are still high. And what we're seeing is that, in Q1, BP posted its highest quarterly profit in a decade. ExxonMobil doubled its profits from last year to $5.48 billion. And Chevron reported a quarterly profit of $6.26 billion, which is over 4 times its earnings of $1.4 billion over the first quarter of last year. So keeping gas prices sky high is, it's easy for these companies because they have such market dominance and are able to exert that market dominance.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Lin, you testified that just a generation ago, the United States boasted the most advanced, robust, and thriving industrial system in the world thanks to anti-monopoly policy and other competition tools. My home state of Rhode Island, manufacturing is really written into our DNA, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, where good-paying manufacturing jobs help build our middle class, But over the years, we've lost these jobs to other countries. And so beyond reviving our competition system, what reforms do you recommend for reclaiming America's identity as leaders in manufacturing and innovation?
The use of trade policy to break all concentrations of power and control and capacity in places like China that do two things. They threaten us because we become dependent on a antagonistic nation for fundamental supplies. But it also allows them to jack up prices. There's a vitamin C antitrust case after which focuses on the way that the Chinese vitamin cartel has jacked up this fundamental supply. So trade has always been one of the most important tools that we've used to deal with concentration of power and create opportunity for manufacturers here in the United States to compete. We should have a robust protectionist trade policy that protects the American people from concentrations of power and protects the international system on which we depend for promoting a peaceful international a set of democracies. Second is corporate governance. We need to use corporate governance to basically ensure that the corporations work for us.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. This hearing has made clear that with the concentrated power comes concentrated risk, whether it's America's energy supply or the availability of baby formula. We've heard this story over and over again. Earlier this year, the subcommittee examined the harms caused by high levels of economic concentration in America's food supply chain. We heard compelling testimony from witnesses that monopoly power was leading to high prices and food shortages for consumers. Supply chains are brittle or broken. Farmers and ranchers are struggling to survive, but the largest meat packers and distributors have raked in record profits. All options must be on the table. We need to update and modernize our antitrust laws and then give enforcers the resources they need to stop anti-competitive conduct and ensure the marketplace is competitive. We need to pursue criminal charges for corporate executives who engage in cartel activities such as price fixing. And we need to prohibit price gouging and explore whether tools like price controls can be used to address inflation and corporate profiteering. We must bring other policy tools to bear as well. We need to incentivize investment in the United States and discourage outsourcing. We need to reorient our tax policies toward long-term economic growth and sustainability, not short-term profits and share buybacks. And most importantly, we need to strengthen worker protections and protect the rights of workers to organize. And finally, we should utilize the Defense Production Act to ensure that we have sufficient supplies of essential goods and to crack down on bad faith hoarding scarce products to resell at exorbitant prices. Again, thank you to the witnesses. This concludes today's hearing. I now, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written materials, additional written questions for the witnesses, or additional materials for the record. And I believe I have a unanimous consent request to include into the record a letter from the National Retail Federation without objection. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.